Yes, and it looks good online.
You okay?
Yeah.
He does take the profile of anymore. Sport I call an old boy. I guess I put it that way in cybersecurity. Firm started in 2001 called Cicadas. Did a lot of cybersecurity work back when we called it incident response management, or information risk management. And we're one of the first 3 firms in town. GBQ, which is an accounting firm, acquired us 7 years ago. That profile that was updated lies about my rugby still was written. But I've been in the industry for quite a long time. It's interesting. The things we talk to clients about today, and the same things we talk to clients about, we talked to clients about in 2001. A lot of cybersecurity work is really health and hygiene, and the network, how you handle information. We control people, and so we don't do that as well as we should. We have incidents all the time. The thing I need to share about this is this was done for the Hilliard Chamber of Commerce, and on St. Patty's Day, which is a reference to luck. And if you know Hilliard, where my kids grew up, we're just down the road from Dublin. Dublin's they're all Irish themed high schools. It was kind of tongue in cheek. It was supposed to be the St. Patty's Day event. Didn't change anything, so if you see some here, leprechaun reference in here, that's where that came from. We're going to talk about three most common risks that we see in businesses. Ransomware obviously really impacting your profession the most. Business email compromise, social engineering. Talk about some of the reasons why just technology controls will impact and some best practices. I saw somebody else's presentation a while ago that this slide was a bunch of bad things for the press, and then the next slide was a bunch of hackers in hoodies. Essentially, we all know that there's bad things. I would imagine at this point, there's a bad thing has happened to your firm, whether it's something small or whether it's something large. You're seeing the effect in the market. Some of the big ones like JBS, they were ransomware, hacking plan was ransomware 2 years ago. It actually affected us as consumers as a certain food, like pork and beef weren't available, and the prices went up. So, this just goes beyond somebody getting into the systems. Now it's having an impact on the economy. We have smaller businesses that we work with that have actually gone out of business, done an asset sale and sold off the business because they've been so impacted. I think this group is largely larger businesses, but that means that you're probably regulated more heavily, and so there's fines and other things associated with it. Cyber event of any type for most firms today is bad news beyond just the information that's stolen or the systems taken with them. I'm not going to read a bunch of statistics, but what we're seeing consistently over the last few years is that firms are being attacked primarily through things that people do. So social engineering to either affect ransomware or business email compromise. Those two issues tend to fight back and forth for the top impact. There are a lot of other bad things that can happen. CEOs can be impersonated. Gift card people can be induced to buy gift cards. We've had an uptick lately in firms who are manufacturers that do retail. So retail is a secondary business, having their website skimmed for credit card data. There's a lot of other things that happen, but the two that all of us have to. Small firm, I had a prospect call in yesterday, single office, home office, that was a victim of a business email. We have small businesses that are impacted by ransomware. You know, a couple of firms in town that have been impacted by ransomware, and the manufacturing firm is not able to produce what they make for 7 weeks because they were so heavily impacted by a ransomware. So other bad things can happen, but statistically, the two that everybody's dealing with, no matter what they do, business email compromise. So the ransomware, particularly after the pandemic, when people pushed home, a lot of firms went to Office 365. They went with the lower licensing because they were trying to control costs. weren't properly protected. Ransomware has kind of gone through the roof. So we figured that out as business people, because as a bad guy, I can make money with ransomware. They're going to continue doing that, and the joke is that we build a 10-foot wall and they build an 11-foot ladder. Many of the organizations that are conducting ransomware are called APTs, or advanced persistent threats. They're criminal gangs, and if you look at the data traffic, their communications traffic, they work regular hours. We're able to tell, the researchers are able to tell what countries they're in based on the holidays. And so these are organized gangs. Some of them is organized as a software developer in terms of versioning their code and taking care of it like it's a real product. The other downside to ransomware is any one of us with a credit card on the dark web and buy ransomware as a service and essentially rent somebody else's ransomware. So on the one hand, we have to deal with very sophisticated organizations. On the other hand, you don't have to be very sophisticated to go rent some of the tools they build. And so we have to see this proliferation of ransomware because we have weak firms and we have people making. We've seen attacks go up. We'll talk about it later on in the presentation. Those attacks going up with insurance carriers pay out more money, which means if you're involved in your insurance renewal conversations as part of the risk team, that's becoming much more full contact support. I don't mean any disrespect, because I imagine there's insurance companies that are in this group. They're not in the business of paying big claims. They're in the business of keeping their claims down as low as possible to restore you. And so with this proliferation of ransomware, it's really impacted us from a business standpoint. We have clients that can't get coverage. Business email compromise is essentially, we also call it a man-in-the-middle attack. If I owe Zach, or Zach, let me use him as an example. He's hiding. If I owe Zach money, and he and I are interacting back and forth, but one of you gets in the middle of that transaction and sends me a note that says, "Oh no, Doug, I appreciate the payment, but I've moved my bank. Here's my new ACH information, or here's the new address." If I don't check with Zach that's an appropriate change, that money's going to end up somewhere else. And it's called business email compromise. Essentially, a bad actor gets in someone's email, typically by guessing a password or getting somebody to click a link and give their credentials on. Gets in an email system, builds rules so that when I send Zach a note, it's redirecting that to somebody else who then forwards it to Zach. And Zach and I both think we're talking, not communicating. We're communicating through a third party who's changing the information. The one yesterday was so good. We're working with a small consultant, and her client, they had so much detail from her client that the email looked like the client, the owner of the firm. It was even some of his mannerisms, because they get in an email, they stay there for quite some time, and learn the patterns, learn who's who, and get in the middle there. So we're seeing a lot of those kind of things, really outside of the realm of continuity, but it's a very large problem in a lot of firms, and your tech guys can't handle it. There's not a lot of technology that can be put in place to completely protect that process. Where we see people, firms be impacted by this email compromise, everything's done in email. Finance and accounting do not have internal controls to call the client. "Hey, Zach, did you really change to the bank in Turkey? This simple kind of, this doesn't make any sense. They banked at Huntington, done business with them for 2 years. They banked at Huntington, they banked at Chase for 20 years. Why are they suddenly banking with Wells Fargo or SunTrust?" We literally, the Bank of Turkey sounds like a joke. It's not yet a firm that paid out to the client that didn't move their banking to the bank in Turkey. We have to be suspicious as we go about our day-to-day activities. But I can't put technology in place to protect the finance and accounting professional who that doesn't have that suspicion. We don't have the internal controls. Some of these attacks are now coming in over the phone. So it's not necessarily a cyber thing, it's not an email thing. It's a criminal that's using old school techniques, if you will, to promote this is kind of the devil football, right? If I can't get my email through spam filters, I can call, find names on LinkedIn, who the accounting people are, track the executive on social media, know when that executive's traveling, and put a story together that allows me to induce somebody to just. So this is email compromise. It's really the second biggest thing we're seeing. I've already touched on social engineering a little bit. If we talk about the risks of ransomware, where somebody takes away my ability to work, I don't have systems that are available, or business email compromise, where somebody actually is taking wealth directly from me. Most of the attacks you see are social media oriented attacks. I have a client that says, "Can you help me prevent my people from doing this?" And so, not to be disrespectful, but most of the time it's dumb stuff. I got one, we self-fish ourselves. And I got one this morning that Brittany James in our compliance office. CBQ doesn't have a compliance office. So I know exactly what that is. It's our IT department testing me. I would imagine most of your firms are doing that as well. It's amazing when firms start to first do that, how high their click rates are. And the reality is that you can write, even with the constant messages coming in, and we know they're coming, you can write a test message that's going to get somebody to click. The bad guys can write a real message to get somebody to click. 7 years of GBQ, I've clicked on one. Yeah, I'm the security guy, but all susceptible to it. My first month in it, when I came in November of 16, they were having a problem with people taking it seriously. They just started. And so an email went out that the Society of Ohio CPAs, the real organization is the Ohio Society of CPAs, flip some words around. There's been a fraud complaint on your license, no longer licensed to function as a CPA in the state of Ohio, to click this link and begin the appeals process. And about 75% of the CPAs in the firm. Now, I dodged a bullet because I'm not a CPA, it wasn't real. But you can write a message. Bad guys can write a message. You can click. Testing raises the bar. You get that. Good job if you report it with most of the tools. A lot of the tools, if you don't report it, you're going to get a little bit of a scold. I know some of the bigger firms we work with, regardless, you end up on a clicker list. You get more testing. So if you get a lot of tests, probably failed a couple times. But it's a big problem because a lot of these events that we see, we track them back, all the thousands, millions of dollars we spend on technology. It's really about shaping people's behaviors, so the behaviors proper. So like my one client says, they don't do stuff. I would assume some of you have been involved in cyber events. When you think about the initial cost, which is the loss, there's typically legal action. In some instances, like with the healthcare space, we see the follow-on legal action being more impactful than what Health and Human Services actually fines folks for. There's not been as many fines as and enforcement action as you would think, but the lawyers jumping on the class action bandwagon after the fact are pretty enormous. So if there's a breach event, the lawyers are coming in. A lot of the events that we see, we're at the table with the attorneys. It's a data breach where we believe the data has been taken. A lot of ransomware comes associated with it's called ransacking. So I'm a bad guy. I get into the organization. I take all the data, and then I encrypt and ransom what's there. Then I convince you to pay me to get your data stored, to get the keys to turn it back on. Then I also say, I've got protected information that you didn't market, and you owe me a second. And so lawyers have to get involved with, and with a number of those things. Of course, you've got the forensics folks coming in as a part of that as well. Just because the bad actor says they have your data, we encrypt it, we know it's encrypted, that's true. We have your data, may not be true. A lot of times they'll present, here's information that we've looked at, and if you want to release it to the public, and sometimes it's their privacy statement. It's not really confidential data, and then you kind of play it up. Insurance carriers are very important in that game. I'm assuming firms that have professionals in the company world focus on insurance as part of that risk management as well. It's important to have a good carrier involved in that breach event. A lot of times they know the hackers. Once we get involved in, it's really interesting if you know who the bad actor is. They identify them by the Bitcoin address. They identify them by sometimes the emails that they're using, and they know them personally. It reminds me of what's the cartoon Foghorn and Leghorn, where they're trying to blow each other up during the day, and then the whistle blows and they go home. It's really kind of interesting how well these folks do each other as these online personas. I'm not suggesting any collaboration. They do know those personalities. We did one investigation with the files like 5 or 6 years ago. Found the Bitcoin address of that actor in Europe, and he was known as a good bad actor, meaning he was honorable. So if you paid him more Bitcoin, he could return the data and then tell you how he got in. Client ended up recovering in another way, but likewise, you can find that actor personas that won't help keep it and release the data even after you've paid it. So the insurance carrier typically has really good intel in regards to who those folks are, or their partner that they're really taking knows those people, and can help figure out what the best thing to do is. We don't recommend you pay because it continues to propagate the market somewhere. If we do a lot of incident response work, we tend to defer to the carrier, let them do the investigation. A lot of these firms now have their own Bitcoin mining. We won't negotiate. You shouldn't negotiate on your own. And obviously, it's probably your InfoSec folks, but to negotiate with the wrong person is this feds would be learned. And so these firms, the carriers and forensic specialists, figure that out. We can just jump in, we don't, and then they don't have it happen again. But those teams that come in as part of that response are important. It's expensive. Insurance covers most of it. Or if you have a breach event, you do nothing. So there's expense there. Business interruption. The example I used, the manufacturing firm here in town that had an outage that 7 weeks, and a lot of times we'll see partial restoration. To get back to doing what they do, but they're doing things on paper for quite some time. The JBS breach and pipeline breach, the big gas pipeline, they paid back to bad actors, not because they didn't have backups, but because the length of time to restore was too long in terms of this disruption cost. You can have cyber liability insurance that lost revenue. But that gets into questions that my accounting friends answer or lawyers answer. I talked to a group of restaurants yesterday, and there was NCR had a major outage. The restaurant management system, Aloha, was ransomware, and most of the restaurants, their gift card and loyalty programs were offline for quite some time. That the way gift cards are accounted for is not considered revenue. And so some of these firms lost hundreds of thousands of dollars in gift card revenue. They couldn't claim it because it wasn't from an accounting perspective considered revenue. So to know the details there, in terms of what the costs of business interruption are, be able to manage those with your carrier, that's an important part of this as well. And then a lot of times there's employees, consumers that we serve, and many times we've got a spot where we can do kind of things. We have to notify them there's costs there, but typically if there's a consumer, particularly those of you that have consumer products or consumer facing services, you're probably going to be buying privacy insurance, identity theft insurance, and other types of things to make them whole for any loss. So the impacts of cyber can go beyond there's a tremendous cost to that. Some of you probably have more stories to tell in that regard, but the balance sheet or the calculator about the cost well beyond just the cost drivers. When a bad thing happens, the quicker I can get to the quicker I can restore recovery, less expensive it's going to be. The more information I know about what happened, the less expensive it's going to be. Or I may have better decision making choices. If I come into an environment to do an investigation and there are no logs to show us whether data left the environment, then some regulatory models that one require you to deal with it as if the data did leave the environment. And that becomes a legal question about do you or don't you notify, do you or don't you use the breach word? But without that information, it's difficult. You're taking it on, some level of risk tolerance. We don't know whether data left the building or not. We don't want to notify 50,000 clients. But if that data ends up in the dark web, it may be shown that it did leave, and then we may be further liable. Versus I've got data that shows that a lot of the firms we've worked with, even bigger firms, don't have the appropriate level of logs and the retention on those logs to go back and show where an attack has occurred, whether that data has been taken or not, and ransacking to the ransomware. So they encrypt and they take the data. They say, I need Bitcoin to give you the data so I don't release it. You need to know whether they really have the data, not the logs. A lot of times business interruption is not thought of from an insurance perspective, and so we get involved in some cases where that's not a part of the policy. And so that calculation was made in advance about the impact. And so that's a cost driver. That's money out of the business's pocket, so to speak, as opposed to money that's covered by the carrier. There are a lot of post-breach costs. Notification is very expensive. There's Target was breached. Gosh, it's old, 10 years ago, or even longer. Their stock went up like a month later. So there's a mixed message out there in terms of the financial cost, in terms of impact of business value, but they're kind of more important. There's a tremendous amount of consumer or client churn. You're going to lose clients. And there's going to be a cost then. If you've done sales before, it's more expensive to find a new client than it is to keep an old client. So the cost of customer acquisition is added to that. Kind of a lot of hidden costs. Many times when we get into an environment, you are following up and helping another manufacturing firm here in Columbus that was ransomware back up to speed, and they spent about $20,000 a year on cybersecurity, and their total spend here over the last 2 months has been about $250,000 putting gear in place. They should have had in place in the first place, but now they're doing it under duress without any kind of information. So many times you're seeing the cost there, and some of the attacks will actually destroy your gear. So you're replacing gear as part of this cost. So the kind of the growing threats and issues we're seeing in terms of the mounting claims. This is actually when I first started with this. Now we're seeing a little bit of a depression in that. Claims are coming down. The attacks are still enormous. The bad guys are still making a lot of money. The insurance companies are getting really good at either figuring out who they're not going to cover or forcing people to do things that make them less of a target. So claims are settling down. Regulatory action is picking up, which is a threat that we're not going to see go away. Legal action, again, we see, I've been doing HIPAA work since it first came out, and they used to talk about the fines. Now, if you go to a lot of HIPAA expert websites, they still talk about how terrible the fines are. I think since enforcement action started, there's only been about 100 fines. Usually, the enforcement actions are against really bad actors, like pharmacy that's dealing oxy out the back door. The only way they can shut them down is with the HIPAA action. What generally we see in the market is if somebody has something happen, it's a reportable breach. Investigations, we've been involved in a lot of them that are $0 enforcement actions. But now the firm's got a duty to report. They've reported that out. The lawyers step in. And then it's a class action lawsuit representing everybody. There's only one group that makes any money in that event. It's the consumer that's lost their data. The attorneys are very aggressive in that state. So we see a lot of legal action followed on. I haven't seen anything, but I have to assume that some of the, I just haven't looked. I have to assume some of the bigger events that JDS and Colonial are bringing business to business actions. But we do get involved in some of the consumers. We see this in expanding attack surface in terms of the way we think about things. First off, in my business, and you guys are a little technical too in what you do. You know, we use like sports and war names to make it all sound a lot cooler. And so attack surface sounds like it comes out of a war movie, but essentially it's the surface that your firm is presenting to the outside world that somebody can gain access to and attack. When I started doing this stuff in the late 90s, we had to protect the website, we had to protect the firewall. There may be an email server or some kind of file server out publicly addressable. The attack surface was relatively small. So I've had clients where we did work for 10 years ago, and it was an internal network, an external network, it's very small, firewall. Now we go in and run down through the asset list, and mobile phones and applications that typically present themselves in the phone as well as in the company. Firms have moved heavily to the cloud. And a lot of times when firms move to the cloud, they've got, for the most part, Office from Microsoft 365. And then typically they've got maybe Microsoft Azure, maybe Amazon, maybe some other cloud providers, multiple cloud providers. You have a number of software as a service applications now in your mix. A lot of us don't have a lot of gear in the data room anymore. We've pushed all that out. As we've pushed all that out, and then as we pushed our employees where we can out and we've kept them at home, that's that attack surface. There's so many different avenues into it. And many times when we get a call about doing an assessment, the firm says, what you do, test our internal network, our firewall, and our external network. And we say, well, what about this, and this? And we don't think about, we're moving to the cloud to save money, but then we don't include that in our testing. Or we don't include that in our, for your sake, continuity. We're worried about restoring the company network, not pay for this service. Or in the case that I spoke to restaurants, and we spent a lot of time talking about the NCR breach. If they were going to sell loyalty cards or gift cards, the loyalty program, their staffing, how much cheese do I need, many of the essentially recipe management, all that was taken offline. And there were a couple of restaurants that you all have probably eaten at yesterday that it was 4, 5, 6 weeks before they could schedule their staff online. So if you think about, I worked at a McDonald's in college, I had 225 employees. We probably did schedule paper then, but to roll that back, you think about that thing, and so we're seeing that because of that expanded tax surface index. And then systemic risk potential, essentially that was part of that. We're aligned today. The common move most firms take now is I do this really, really well, I don't do these things really well, so I'm going to outsource it. The minute I outsource it, I'm expanding my risk. I need to manage that risk. A lot of times, continuity professionals, cyber professionals, risk professionals in an organization don't even see the contracts. So you don't know that the exposure is there or what their role is going to be in playing to help sport until the event happens. So we talk a lot about left of the breach. And if you think about a timeline, when we start a year in January, we move to the end of the year. So I'm backwards for you guys, but it's from left to right. So we want to get in front of the breach event. The breach event is in June. There's things I want to be doing to the left of it. We want to consider adopting a framework. I think most of you are in bigger organizations. You probably have adopted a framework. Talk with your broker, at least annually, to review your coverage. I wouldn't, it's going to be determined by how you guys are oriented, but I would assume that at some level you ought to be able to be in a conversation with the insurance firm as a continuity professional because you're so heavily impacted. I know some organizations, because of structure or politics, you're not going to be able to, but you want to know what's available from an insurance perspective, be able to include that in your continuity plans. We encourage people to talk to their bankers. The banks are getting killed with some of this stuff. You want to have the plan for when it happens that a firm has taken a full-time slot and given it to somebody in your profession as soon as you're in firms that do think about what when it happens. We work with a lot of firms. And then know your sport. So let's start with the basics. There's a set of technologies that need to be in place, and if I were to truly list them all, the slide would be too busy. But I want to protect identity, so I want to have strong passwords. I want to have multi-factor. I want to be able to have an incident plan and know how I'm going to manage an incident. I want to monitor, again, the logs and the monitoring that I spoke about are really important. I want to understand my home and mobile working. One of the companies I spoke to this week, their controller has secured a permanently hybrid work from home position. Her husband also works from home. The kids, a lot of times are there, and so she goes to the public library to do all of the financial work. The CFO said, "Is that a problem?" Our IT guys say it's not, but she's essentially banking in a public interface, and so it is a problem. Airports, Starbucks, any places like this, any place that's public where people are using Wi-Fi. If you've got employees working there, the minimum there ought to be a VPN. Well, if I work at a Starbucks, work on GBQ systems, I'm VPNing into the company. But I bank with Chase. If I'm banking with Chase, I'm not banking with Chase at Starbucks because I'm not on a security. And so that's something that needs to be taken into consideration. Our configuration secure, again, outside of your all's wheelhouse, but IT ought to know what a secure config is and then they ought to maintain it. Movable media controls, it was pre-pandemic. GBQ said no more USBs unless it was encrypted and secured. And we got these iron keys that weighed about 12 pounds. You guys ever see them? They're metal. I've probably washed hundreds of USB sticks in my day. You can wash one of them and it's going to make it through. But the act of going to IT, opening a ticket, having them give you one that was encrypted with one password, killed the USB. Everybody complained about it for about a month, and then we stopped using USB keys. So that mobile information is a problem still if you've got USB. User education and awareness, biggest bang for the buck. If you're not training people to, again, not do dumb stuff, that dollar is going to be better spent than any other dollar in this whole stack. Because again, generally that last small percentage of controls that are missing is the piece. Not just the don't do dumb stuff. Here's how to handle confidential information. The accounting and financial professionals know how to address finance change banking information. don't think about that in advance, there's going to be mistakes. I spoke to a group at a Chamber of Commerce. This may be things that you've been involved in, but we really encourage businesses to adopt the security framework. The slide gets busy. I can do, and nobody would want to come to it, a day-long session on all the different frameworks. So a lot of times you're going to hear NIST cybersecurity framework. I don't know if you all know what you're using. CSF, anybody using the bigger 853. And then there's an international standard that's not on here, ISO 27000, anybody using that? And then a lot of smaller firms or firms that aren't very mature use this another control framework. Our encouragement is if you're a US-based organization, leading the NIST side, if you're international, then you consider it both or leading the ISO side. But firms ought to have a framework selected. That way we don't have to sit in a room and think about what our continuity controls are. We can say these controls need to be in the framework and start to build that out. And then say, what risks haven't we covered? Rather than, it's Doug's framework on the whiteboard, which is going to be not as good as something that's thought about by people that do nothing but think about this. Talk to your insurance broker. If you are around my age, you remember Warren Zevon. He's passed away, but he had a great song. Essentially, the line was "Send lawyers, guns, and money. Dad, get me out of this." It was Werewolves in London. That's really what insurance is. And I've talked to a lot of business people that aren't technical in things, cyber liability insurance, and active control. If I have cyber liability insurance, it's bad things. It's going to support you. It's going to help you respond and recover. And it's a very important tool. I was surprised in 12 restaurants that I spoke to this week. There were 3 firms that didn't have cyber liability insurance. It was shocking to me. And it wasn't because they weren't able to get coverage, they just chose not to speak it. These were firms that are doing a lot of our relationship with restaurants, really very heavily driven through technology these days. So huge exposure there, but they didn't see it. We encourage when you talk to your broker, make sure that the broker brings a cyber specialist to the table. The carriers, because they're not in the business of big things, do a really good job of shifting things. So if I attack you through your email server and break in and get a business email compromise action going because I've been able to break in, guess the password, that's a cyber attack. If I call your controller on the phone and induce him or her to change banking information through a phone call, it's not a cyber attack. It's crime. And if you don't have crime associated with your policy, that's not going to get covered. So it's important to have somebody at the table that understands how the carriers have shifted things around. Typically, a lot of firms have a cyber rider on their property and casualty. And if you look at the if it was spam or if it was phishing, it doesn't count. If it was this, it doesn't count, and that it doesn't count. So we're going to cover this small thing. So you want to understand what is covered. Again, talk to your banker. If this was more for small business people, but your organization ought to be having conversations with the banker. You ought to encourage it, whether you can get taken to lunch with the banker and everybody else gets. But that conversation ought to happen as well. The banks are getting killed. I'm a bank. You bank with me for 25 years, and I make a mistake and send money to, and they're generally tens of thousands of dollars to one organization. And because of the way we are as human beings, I don't blame the bank, even though I'm the one that did it. So the banks are getting killed. How do I retain this client that's blaming me for something they did and just lost $100,000 I can't restore them? So the banks really want to have these conversations. And we encourage clients to do that. We work with a lot of, as an accounting firm, a lot of the banking institutions here in town. And the individual bankers struggle sometimes to get their clients to sit down and talk about cyber liability and cyber risks. And And again, I think you guys lean towards bigger organizations, probably unheard of. You get into the small market, and that's the mid market, and that's it. This is the slide that you guys know more about than I do. Plan for disaster. Most of the clients that we work with, let's talk a little bit with Zach beforehand. Most of the clients that we work with are mid-market companies are privately held, and so the continuity professional is the cybersecurity professional, the IT professional is the jack of all trades. Bigger organizations typically have professionals that put this together. You can recognize the graphics from the NIST continuity incident response recovery document sets. We encourage firms to have those in place. We do a financial audit. And those are controls that we look for as continuity plans, disaster recovery plans. A lot of firms don't take the steps of writing things down. Just in our experience again in the mid-market, they don't take the steps of testing the plan. So doing tabletop tests. They don't take the test or the step of actually testing response. So we work with some clients with a tabletop test, exercise. Any of your firms do that. So you put the bad actor, pen tester who's acting like a bad actor. So he's red. Tell you how we get to purple. And then we put a defender in place, he's blue. So if you understand military wargaming, they go red and blue. If you play too much Halo with your kids, you understand it's red versus blue. But essentially, you put the two together and it's purple. And it's one thing to do a tabletop exercise and know that marketing has this role in terms of crisis management. We know the lawyer to call. We know who the coach, the breach coach is. I assume a lot of you have been through tabletops. We've actually done tabletop tests where we sat in a room with 25, 30 managers like this room and said, here's the event that's happened. What are you going to do? And somebody says, I'm going to get in my file folder that has the incident response plan, and I'm going to follow it. And it's like, but that's the system that's been improved. And so it shakes up those problems. And a lot of firms don't do the testing. They don't. Mid-market, there's not a lot of documentation. And we encourage, even if it's just a few pages, to have something down. I know I see some of the brands in here. You have much more than just a few pages. But those plans are really important. We get involved in an event. If there's a plan, generally we get things stood up quicker. So back to that, what are the costs? That dwell time makes it more expensive. But if we get things stood up quicker, the costs are going to go down. And it really requires that written plan that's been tested, practiced, and people know where it is on it. Our approach is that every year you got to be assessing. Assess risk, assess how well the IT program works. A lot of times we get engaged to do cybersecurity risk assessment, for instance. And the controls are pretty much in place, they're effective. But IT isn't very well organized, it doesn't function very maturely. And so we'll do a lot of program assessments as well, because sometimes it's not just when I'm in, are we finding things as they should be, it's what's the regular. So we do a lot of program, and some of that gets into other areas of business where business leadership says we're spending $1 million on IT costs, IT staffing costs, and I don't think we have the right people. So that has an impact to this. We look at that. Compliance controls, vulnerability, regardless of what that interface is. When I talk about attack surface growth, I didn't mention IoT. A lot of times now we're getting into organizations where they're not manufacturers, so they don't have control systems on the factory floor. But 10% of the population on the network are building controls, and they don't even know they're there. So we want to make sure we test that whole piece. You go through improvement where you're fixing things, and then back on the back end, you want to test, manage, and assure. We typically assess and then pen test. We also assess and then audit. So I've got CPAs back in the firm that do SOC audits for clients that really you need to do the right things to protect your organization. And sometimes you have a stakeholder that says, prove to me that you're doing what you say you do. And that's essentially what the audits. The audits aren't a protective control. They're an assurance control that lets your stakeholders know you're doing it. that's the typical pattern. That we see is you want to assess, you want to go through the improvement process, you want to make sure that you're managing over time, and assuring your stakeholders that you're doing the right thing. And then it starts all over again. And if you're not doing some of this stuff on an annual basis, we have clients now that every time they put the technology in, they hire us to do a quick test. We have other clients that are starting to do ongoing continuous risk assessment because everything's changing. So, of course, the costs are getting pushed up, but this basic model, regardless of how frequent you need to assess and then go through fixing the things you find, and making sure you're managing those risks. And then lastly, know your score. You may not know this, but a lot of there's bid sites or security scorecard. These are open source intelligence tools that are being used by, if you're a part of it, if you're downstream in a supply chain, or supply chain, the firm that you're selling to may be using these tools to grade you. Insurance carriers are using these tools to grade you, and security scorecard, we're in partnership with them. They use open source information, so they're not invasive, not scanning your network, they're grabbing digital breadcrumbs around the world. This is a big company, Global Finance. You're going to see. So in my home, I would not have been went out on the weekends for about a month after great. But they have an F on network security. They have an F on patching cadence. They've got a B on the website. We see a lot of firms that get a B, and they have a C or D on the application space, and CIO says, well, I'm not responsible for the website. Well, then somebody's probably not watching security. So this actually, we picked these guys because they have a freemium. You can sign up, maybe somebody at your firm doing it. And for business owners, we give one out. I've got some clients. And I left a sheet back there if you want us to run it. You can sign up for yourself with security scorecard and then monitor up to 5 vendors with it. Bid sites and some of the others are really expensive. I think I can tell a story. One of our clients is first we have group, and the CIO out there, Steve Smolinski, called April 2020, and Bid Sites was out there talking to the CIO or the CEO and run their score. The score was bad. He ran a scorecard, and it turned out that commercial vehicle wasn't the bad reason for the bad score. There was the Reddit called the coronavirus group, CVG, that was showing up on that report. And so it's important that you attend to this because there can be bad data that affects your score. You have clients that use it to, board uses it to kind of monitor things. But the more important thing is that it's affecting organizations, underwriting and through vendor risk management. If I've got Honda has 600 suppliers, I don't know if they're using this, but that's 600 surveys that go out. That's how many ever hundreds of soccer posts we do. It's not continuous monitoring. We're seeing vendor risk management programs adopting this to monitor all the vendors. So if you're one of those firms that's doing a lot of work with supply chain, you validate it a lot. This may be and I think we're even for a little AV gymnastics. We're about right in time. Are there any questions?
This last week was a comment this last week. Used speed as the name and words name and got an email back in said pick up the go to the post office. It's just
Yeah, I get occasionally there's a text in the post office that says trying to deliver a package to address post office. It's pretty obvious. I'm getting. I've been exposed to do a lot of social media, a lot of LinkedIn, a lot of speaking. So you had a blast of emails to interns and new staff last week with my name on it, asking them to do something. And it wasn't me. And it's amazing how they get this information. They get it because the bad actors are using big data, just like some of your marketing departments are using big data to figure out where my customers are. They're saying, Doug's acting on LinkedIn, he's got this person, this public persona, here are all the employees at GTQ, I'm a new staff, I'm banging on LinkedIn, excited about telling the world, mom and dad and all my friends that I got a job. And suddenly they put that together, and this intern I've never met says, why did you send me an email? You didn't, actually, she was pretty heads up. She said, this isn't you, but I saw you in chat. And she's in tax people, and we work with them. I'm working with the director of the staff, and no reason for me to. Likewise, it's kind of get suspicious. Where they know, sometimes it's just they blast it out.
Well, no, Google.
Yeah.
First of all,
Yeah, so off topic, but it's good. Every cloud provider has its own shared responsibilities. So when you're contracting, and some of these contracts, just accept that Apple's with the new patch, just ridiculous. But you want to look at that shared responsibility because that's the actual name in both the Microsoft and Amazon contracts. Those firms tell you what you're responsible for. So that would be the best starting to look at what Google says you're responsible. We think the got here on the west side between here and Dublin and the big games. And this is even more in the west. The big games server rooms. There's a lot of security. Those are iron fences. Those aren't your identity. And so you want to look at the shared responsibility. So you want to do that personally as well as. Any other questions?
Great presentation. Excellent content.
Should we be for example, our state?
So the state of Ohio actually, anything cyber related. 2 years ago, there was an act, data protection act. It says any firm that can show reasonable compliance with 7 frameworks. Talk about frameworks. You can show reasonable compliance. There's a positive defense in a breach. That as long as the cases file, that the firm can bring to the table. So Ohio is the only state that has a proactive legislation. You go to New York, California, other states, and it's punitive. You didn't do this. And Ohio says if you do these things, challenge is, and I don't know what coverage, you got to cover your organization. A lot of the firms here, I think, are probably national. And then each, you got to deal with each state, and you got to deal with the feds, and then healthcare, credit cards to pay for patients to pay for service. I've got multiple obligations. The panacea is all we're going to go and do these things. But I have such a thing that's never going to happen. That would be the one thing that the government can do. But we're actually in a pretty good spot.
Recording is back.